The helicopter came in low over the rooftops of Alderton, Georgia, at 17 minutes before 6 in the morning, its rotor blades cutting through air that still smelled of the previous night's rain, and the sound of it reached the parking lot of the Alderton Police Department before the first federal vehicle had even rolled into position on the street below. By the time the sun had fully cleared the tree line, the parking lot was sealed behind crime scene tape that snapped and shivered in the early morning wind, and agents in dark jackets were carrying evidence boxes out of the building in long, careful rows, each one numbered, each one sealed, each one representing some piece of a structure that had taken 6 years to build and less than 1 morning to dismantle. The officers who had reported for the early shift were standing in a loose cluster near the fence, some still holding their coffee cups, none of them speaking, all of them watching. The woman who had made every bit of it happen was not there to see any of it. She was 3 blocks away, unlocking the green door of Washington's Corner Market at 5:58 in the morning, the way she had unlocked it every single day for 19 years, rain or shine, sick or well, grieving or grateful. The hinges giving the same small, familiar creak they had given since the afternoon she first hung the hand-painted sign above the entrance and stood on the sidewalk looking up at it for a long time before she could make herself go back inside. The bell above the door rang once, clear and bright in the empty shop, and Gloria Mae Washington stepped through into the particular smell of her own place. Fresh bread from the delivery that had come an hour earlier, coffee grounds from the first pot already brewing in the back, the faint, clean bite of pine sol on worn linoleum, and underneath all of it, the sweetness of the candy rack positioned near the register, where children always seemed to drift without quite meaning to. Alderton, Georgia was not the kind of town that appeared on lists. It was not charming enough for travel writers and not troubled enough for documentaries, which meant it existed in the particular invisible space that most American towns occupy, full of people doing real things with real consequences, mostly without anyone outside their own zip code ever knowing or caring. The block that Washington's Corner Market sat on had seen better decades, the kind of street where ambition arrived young and left early, where the storefronts told the history of the neighborhood in layers. A hardware store that had become a nail salon, that had become a vacant window with a for lease sign that nobody ever called about. But the corner market had stayed. 19 years of staying, through the years when staying felt like stubbornness, and the years when staying felt like grace. Gloria moved through the shop the way water moves through a familiar channel, without thinking, without hesitation, touching the things that needed touching, straightening the things that had shifted in the night, running her hand along the edge of the wooden counter that had been worn pale and smooth in the spot where she leaned when she talked to customers, which was something she did constantly because talking to customers was not a task she performed so much as a condition of being alive. She remembered names the way other people remembered song lyrics, not as a skill she had developed, not as a strategy for good business, but as a simple fact of how her mind worked, the way some people can hear a song once and carry it forever. She remembered names, and she remembered the details that lived around them, the texture of a person's daily life that most people never expected anyone to notice. Mrs. Eleanor Teague, who came in every morning at 7:20, took her coffee with exactly 1 sugar, and had opinions about it. Not loudly, not rudely, but with the particular conviction of a woman who had been drinking coffee for 60 years and knew precisely what she wanted, and did not consider that unreasonable. Old Mr. Bernard Holt, who came in on Tuesday and Friday afternoons, always paid in exact change, sliding his coins across the counter one at a time, slowly and deliberately, as though each one represented a small and separate decision. And Gloria always waited without rushing him, because hurrying Mr. Holt was both impossible and beside the point. And then there were Deshaun Marcus, and the third one everybody just called Bug. 3 teenage boys from the Franklin apartments 2 streets over, who came in every single afternoon after school and bought the same barbecue chips and the same Sprite and laughed too loud at something on one of their phones and left the door open behind them every single time without exception, as though the concept of closing a door behind you was something that happened to other people. Gloria had come back to Alderton not because it was easy, but because it was hers, and those two things were different. She had spent 22 years away from it, and when she came back, she did not make a production of her return. She simply appeared one morning, signed a lease on the corner space that had been sitting empty, and started stocking shelves. The shop had survived when other businesses around it had not, when the hardware store on the far end of the block had shuttered, and the laundromat 2 doors down had changed hands twice in 5 years without ever finding its footing again, when the barber shop had relocated and then simply stopped existing. Some months the survival was not comfortable. Some months the only way the shelves stayed stocked was if Gloria skipped her own dinner, a fact she never mentioned to anyone, and would have denied with some impatience if pressed. She didn't complain about it, and she didn't want credit for it. It was simply what the math required, and she had always been practical about math. She kept the shop clear of politics and gossip with the same quiet consistency she applied to everything else. Not because she lacked opinions, because she had plenty, but because the shop was not the place for them. Whenever a customer tried to drag her into an argument about the city council or the school board, or whatever had been on the news the night before, she would turn the conversation gently, but firmly, back toward the weather or the ball game, and she would do it so smoothly that the customer rarely noticed the turn had been made. The shop was a place where people felt welcome regardless of what they believed, and that was something Gloria had decided on the first day and never revisited. The shop was small, the shelves a little crowded, the linoleum worn pale in a path from the door to the counter that traced 19 years of foot traffic like a map of everything that had happened here. The register was an older model that stuck on the third drawer if you pressed it too hard, and required a specific combination of patience and angle that Gloria had mastered and never bothered to explain to anyone else. But it was hers, all of it, and it had a heartbeat. And on this particular morning, with the smell of coffee filling the space and the sky outside going from gray to pale gold through the front window, it felt like the most solid thing in the world. She did not yet know that 3 blocks away, federal agents were carrying pieces of something out of a building in long, careful rows. She simply made her first cup of coffee and stood at the front window and watched Alderton wake up, the way she had done every morning for 19 years. Gloria had been noticing things for months before anyone said anything to her directly noticing them, the way a person notices a change in weather. Not as a single dramatic moment, but as an accumulation of small wrongnesses that refuse to add up to anything comfortable, no matter how many reasonable explanations you try to arrange around them. She had been telling herself for most of those months that there was probably a sensible explanation for all of it, because she had learned over a long life that most things have sensible explanations, if you are patient enough to look for them, and because she had made a deliberate choice 19 years ago to stop looking for trouble in places where it had not yet announced itself. But the things she had been noticing were not subtle once you started paying attention. Patrol cars idling outside storefronts on the block for 20 minutes, sometimes 30, far longer than any routine check or courtesy pass had ever required in the 19 years she had been watching this street. Shop owners stepping outside to speak with officers in voices so low they were barely audible from 5 feet away, and then coming back inside afterward, looking smaller than when they had left, as though something had been subtracted from them in the conversation, and they had not yet figured out how to get it back. The Sunrise Bakery, run by a quiet woman named Adele, who had been baking the same rye loaves for 20 years, had raised its prices twice in a single season without offering any explanation that made sense given the cost of flour. Alderton Family Pharmacy had started closing an hour earlier than it used to, its owner offering nothing more than a tired shrug when customers asked about the change in hours. And Darnell Price's auto repair shop had a new padlock on the side door that had not been there the previous spring, padlocking a door that had stood open every working day for as long as anyone on the block could remember. Gloria had told herself that these were the ordinary hardships of running a small business in a town that had never had much to spare, that she was pattern-matching things that did not actually connect, that whatever was happening around her was not her business to interfere with. That she had left a certain kind of life behind her when she hung up her uniform for the last time, and she had no intention of picking it back up. She had been very committed to that story for most of those months, And then Raymond Fuller leaned over her counter one evening while she was cashing out the register. His voice dropped so low she almost had to lean forward to hear it, and told her that next week it would be her turn. He did not explain. He did not elaborate. He looked at her for one long second, and then he pulled his jacket closer and walked out, and the bell above the door rang behind him, and Gloria stood at the register with her hand on the drawer and listened to the sound of his footsteps on the sidewalk getting quieter. And then she stood there a while longer after that. She closed the shop and she turned off the lights in the back, and she stood at her own front window for a long time, watching the empty street under the orange glow of the street lamps. And something shifted inside her. Some gear that she had been deliberately keeping disengaged for a very long time, quietly and without drama, settling back into place. She noticed, standing there, that she was already doing something she had not done consciously in years. She was reading the street. Not looking at it the way she looked at it every morning when she opened up checking the weather, watching who was out. The ordinary visual intake of a woman who had spent 2 decades on this block and knew it the way you know the layout of a room you have lived in for a long time. She was reading it the way she had once been trained to read any unfamiliar terrain, noting the sight lines, the shadows, the places where something could approach without being seen until it was very close. Her right hand rested on the counter edge without her having placed it there deliberately, her thumb moving back and forth across the worn wood in a slow, repetitive arc. And she recognized that gesture from another life, and stopped it deliberately, and took a breath. Whatever was coming toward her had already found her address. The question she was now asking herself for the first time in 19 years was not whether to avoid it, but what to do about it. And that was a different question entirely, one that came with different answers and required a different kind of thinking. She turned off the front light and locked the door and walked home through the quiet streets of Alderton, and the September air smelled like rain coming, and she breathed it in and walked steadily, and thought very carefully about what Raymond Fuller had not said. They came on a Tuesday afternoon in the flat gray light of an overcast September. Lieutenant Carl Briggs leading officers Pete Duvall and Randy Cole flanking and following, and the bell above the door rang twice when they pushed through the second ring, slightly off from the first, the way it always was when 2 people entered close together. And Gloria, who was behind the counter helping a woman compare 2 brands of canned tomatoes, heard the sound and looked up, and knew, with the particular certainty of someone whose instincts had spent 19 years going unused and several weeks quietly re-engaging, that this was the thing Raymond Fuller had not said. Briggs was a broad man, 44 years old, with a buzz cut that was going gray at the temples in a way he probably considered distinguished, and a jaw that seemed permanently clenched, as though he had spent so many years holding his face in an expression of barely contained authority that the muscles had simply given up and settled there permanently. He walked with a forward lean, his weight always slightly ahead of himself, like a man who expected resistance and had decided to get there first. The first thing he did after he came through the door was crack his knuckles, both hands a single, deliberate roll of his fingers, and the sound of it was quiet, but somehow filled the space between his entrance and whatever came next. A small performance of ownership that he probably did not even know he was performing anymore. Then he set his coffee cup down on Gloria's counter without asking, without looking at her for permission, the way a man sets something down when he has already decided the surface belongs to him, and the question of whose name is on the lease is a formality beneath his notice. The shop had 4 customers in it when the 3 officers walked through the door. Within 3 minutes, it had none. A woman near the bread aisle set down the loaf she was holding and moved toward the exit without making eye contact with anyone. A man who had been reaching for a jug of orange juice changed direction so smoothly it might have looked like he had simply remembered something else and let himself out. An older woman near the cooler in the back hesitated, looked at the officers, and then looked at Gloria. And Gloria gave her the smallest possible nod, and the woman found a reason to leave. The teenage boy by the chips display pocketed his phone and went out without buying anything, and the bell rang twice more, and then the shop was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day. Duvall and Cole positioned themselves near the entrance without appearing to try. Arms, crossed their eyes, moving slowly over the shelves, the way eyes move when they are cataloging rather than browsing. Taking inventory, not of what was available for sale, but of what might be worth breaking later. Briggs picked up a small jar of hot sauce from the display nearest the counter and turned it in his hand, examining it with the exaggerated interest of a man who has no interest in the object, but a great deal of interest in establishing that he can handle other people's property without their permission. He called it a community safety assessment fee. He said it the way he said everything, with the casual, almost cheerful confidence of a man who has told a particular lie so many times that he has long since stopped being able to hear the lie in it, the way you stop hearing an accent after enough years. He explained what the fee covered, what the fee prevented, and what would happen in its absence. And he did all of this in the measured, almost helpful tone of someone reading from a checklist he has used many times before and found entirely reliable. The health inspection that would discover violations nobody had ever noticed before, a thermometer reading a single degree out of range, a crack in the tile that had been there since the Carter administration suddenly becoming a code issue. The permit review that would be initiated, its paperwork somehow always getting lost in transit. The review itself somehow always requiring one more document, one more form, one more week. The citation for something so small it would take a lawyer to explain it and cost more in legal fees to fight than to simply accept. And eventually, if all of that proved insufficient, a padlock on the green door and a notice taped to the glass that nobody in the Alderton Police Department would ever admit to having signed. He listed the businesses that had already paid, and he listed them the way a man lists things he is proud of. The Sunrise Bakery, Alderton Family Pharmacy, Darnell Price's Garage, Raymond Fuller's Restaurant, and 4 others whose names Gloria recognized and whose owners she had known for years. He listed them as evidence of his own authority, rather than as evidence of a neighborhood that had been slowly and methodically strangled into silence. And the distinction between those two things was apparently not one that had ever occurred to him. He said she was the last holdout, the stubborn exception in an otherwise cooperating block. And he said it with the particular tone of a man who considers a compliment and a threat to be the same instrument played at different volumes. The amount was $4,500, due in 3 days. Gloria did not raise her voice. She did not step back. She did not reach for the phone beneath the counter or call out for anyone or let anything change in her expression that she did not choose to let change. She wiped her hands on the small white towel she kept beside the register, folded it once with the same unhurried care she gave to everything, set it down, and looked at Lieutenant Carl Briggs with an expression that was completely calm and completely direct, and entirely absent of the deference he was accustomed to receiving from people who stood where she was standing. She asked him whether there would be a receipt for the payment. The question arrived in the room with the weight of something much larger than its words. Briggs stared at her for 1 full second, and Duvall and Cole exchanged a glance near the entrance, and then all 3 of them laughed. That particular expansive, easy laughter of men who have never once in their professional lives encountered a consequence they could not walk away from. The laughter of men whose authority had never been seriously questioned by someone standing on the other side of a counter. Briggs stopped laughing before the other 2 did, and his eyes stayed on Gloria a beat longer than was comfortable. And then he brought his open palm down on the counter hard enough to send the gum rack sliding off its hook and clatter to the floor. And he leaned in close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, the same coffee that was sitting in the cup he had set on her counter without asking. He told her that around here he was the law, that nobody had ever stopped him, that Alderton belonged to him, and it had always belonged to him, and that people like her built things with their hands thinking it made them somebody, but it did not make them somebody. It just gave them something to lose. He said it slowly, making sure each word landed where he intended it, his voice pitched low and certain, the voice of a man who had said this particular thing, or something very close to it, many times before, and had always been right. He cracked his knuckles again, one final roll, both hands, looked at her for a long moment with the flat satisfaction of a man who considers the conversation concluded, and he walked out with Duvall and Cole trailing behind him, the bell above the door ringing twice in their wake, and then the shop was quiet again. and the coffee cup he had set on her counter without asking was still sitting there, and the gum rack was still on the floor, and Gloria Washington stood behind her counter and looked at the door, and did not move for a long moment. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had just received a very important piece of information. In the days that followed, Gloria began asking questions the way she had once gathered intelligence. Not by announcing herself, not by making her intentions known, but by being present and patient and willing to wait for the truth to find its own way to the surface. She caught people in the quiet intervals, in the spaces the day leaves between its busier moments. After the shop had emptied out for the evening, when the last customer had gone, and the street outside had settled into its nighttime register, and the kind of honest conversation that cannot happen in daylight becomes possible in the particular privacy of a closed store, and two people who have known each other long enough to skip certain formalities. What she learned chilled her in a way that very few things in her life had managed to do, and she had spent a significant portion of her life in situations specifically designed to be chilling. Raymond Fuller told her his story on a Wednesday evening, sitting alone in the dining room of the restaurant that was no longer a restaurant, the chairs stacked upside down on the tables around him, the lights off except for the single bulb above the booth where he sat, a man occupying a room that had been built for 50 people and now held only him. Raymond was in his middle 60s, a heavy-set man with large, careful hands that he kept flat on the table in front of him while he talked, as though he needed the surface beneath his palms to keep himself steady. He told Gloria about the first visit from Briggs, which had occurred 3 years earlier, when the amount requested had seemed almost manageable. Not reasonable, never reasonable, but survivable. And about every visit after that, when the number climbed a little higher and the justification grew a little thinner, until eventually there was no pretense of justification at all, just the amount and the deadline and the understanding of what happened if both were not met. He had gone to the city council once, quietly taking a Tuesday morning off to sit in a waiting room for 2 hours before being given 15 minutes with an aide who listened and made notes and told him to contact Internal Affairs. Internal Affairs had taken his statement, thanked him for coming in, and closed the file within the week. 3 words appeared on the closing summary, stamped there with the mechanical finality of something that had never been intended to go any further. No evidence found. He had gone back to paying. He had gone on paying, month after month, each month the envelope a little thicker than the month before, until the morning came when there was no more envelope because there was no more money. And 2 weeks after that, the restaurant closed on a Wednesday afternoon in March, and Raymond had locked the door and stood outside on the sidewalk for a moment before he got in his car. He told Gloria that he still drove past the building sometimes, not on purpose, just because the route was familiar, and the body goes where it has always gone when the mind is not paying attention. His voice did not waver when he told her this. He had told it to himself enough times that the jagged edges had gone smooth. Lucia Vargas had left town, which meant her story came to Gloria second-hand, relayed in pieces by people who had known her and by a single phone call from Lucia's daughter, who had tracked Gloria down through the neighborhood grapevine because she thought someone on the block should know. Lucia had run the hair salon at the far end of the block for 11 years, a warm place with too many plants in the window, and a waiting area that always smelled of whatever someone's mother had cooked the previous weekend, because Lucia had a rule about food in the shop that she cheerfully violated herself on a daily basis. When Briggs's arrangement reached her, Lucia had done something that none of the other shop owners had attempted. She had gone to 2 neighboring business owners and proposed that they file a complaint together, reasoning sensibly that there was more protection in numbers and that a group complaint was harder to dismiss than a single voice. Within the week, her salon had failed a fire inspection for a violation that had never been cited before, and had not been cited because it did not previously exist. Within 2 weeks after that, a noise complaint had been filed against her by someone whose name she was never given, for a noise that no one in the building could identify. She had closed her blinds one afternoon and not opened them again. Her daughter told Gloria that Lucia was living with relatives in another city now, and had not spoken about the salon since the first month after she left, as though talking about it cost something she could not currently afford to spend. Darnell Price was still there, still operating, though operating in the reduced and cautious way of a man who has learned to keep his head below a certain height. He had paid Briggs for just over 2 years, the envelopes handed over in the side office of his garage, never receipted, never acknowledged in any way that a paper trail might catch. He had missed one payment, one the only time in 2 years, because his daughter had needed emergency surgery, and the money that would have gone into the envelope had gone instead to a hospital bill. And he had told himself that a single missed payment with that reason behind it would be understood, or at least ignored. The following week, his shop had failed an inspection for a fabricated violation that an officer had written onto a form without looking at anything, a violation describing a structural condition that did not exist, in a building that Darnell had maintained meticulously for 15 years. The padlock appeared on the side door 4 days later. He had managed to keep the front bay running barely, but he had lost 2 mechanics who could not wait out the uncertainty and could not afford to work somewhere that might not exist in a month. He told Gloria, and this was the part that stayed with her longest, that what had broken him was not the money. He had found ways around the money, had mortgaged things, had called in favors, had made the math work in ways that would embarrass him later. But the specific, precise humiliation of standing in his own garage and watching a uniformed officer invent a lie on a piece of official paper in front of him, invent it without embarrassment or hesitation, and knowing that he could not use the word lie out loud without making everything immediately and catastrophically worse. Gloria walked home that night past storefronts that had been full of light when she first moved back to Alderton, and were now dark, some of them dark for years. And she understood something she had been almost understanding for months. The understanding arriving the way certain understandings do, slowly and then with a completeness that made the slowness feel absurd in retrospect. This was not a handful of bad officers taking advantage of an opportunity. This was a structure built deliberately, maintained, carefully protected by silence and fear, and a complaints process that had been engineered to produce the same 3-word result every time. She had seen structures like this before. She had spent years of her life learning to recognize them in far more dangerous contexts, and the recognition that was settling over her now, walking through the quiet streets of Alderton, past the ghosts of businesses that used to be alive, was not the surprised recognition of someone discovering something unexpected. It was the grim and familiar recognition of someone seeing a shape they already knew in a place they had hoped never to find it. Carl Briggs had been on the Alderton Police Department for 11 years, and he had risen through its ranks not through any particular gift for police work. His case closure rate was average, his commendations were few, and his internal reviews contained a string of lukewarm assessments that damned with the particular faint praise of supervisors who had neither the interest nor the courage to write the truth. But through a precise and instinctive talent for identifying which superiors needed flattering, which rules could be bent without generating paperwork, and which situations could be shaped to his advantage if he simply showed enough confident patience. At his desk on the 3rd floor of the precinct in the 20 minutes before his shift began each morning, he had a habit of cracking his knuckles while he reviewed his schedule for the day, both hands methodical, moving from pinky to index finger and back. And the officers who had desks near his had learned to use the sound as a signal that he was present and in the particular mood that came before he went out on patrol, which was a mood best described as proprietorial. The scheme had not originated with Briggs, not entirely. It had been passed to him almost as a professional courtesy by a sergeant named Dale Owens, who had retired 2 years earlier and had spent his last month on the job walking Briggs through the mechanics of the arrangement with the calm efficiency of a man transferring ownership of a business he had built and was proud of. Owens had started smaller, more cautious, limiting the arrangement to 4 businesses on 2 patrol routes, keeping the amounts modest enough that most owners concluded it was cheaper and quieter to pay than to fight. Briggs had expanded it with the confidence of someone who had inherited a working model and saw no reason to be conservative about scaling it up. Greedier, bolder, more thorough in his approach to enforcement, adding the internal filing mechanism that ensured complaints went nowhere. Developing the relationship with internal affairs that guaranteed every closed file would carry the same 3 words, extending the patrol route coverage to include 34 businesses across 6 years. The political roof that kept the rain off the whole operation belonged to Captain Mason Hoyt, a 55-year-old man whose face had the look of someone who had spent decades deciding that the most prudent approach to difficult information was to arrange not to receive it. Hoyt had mastered the art of the strategic blind spot. He signed what Briggs put in front of him, asked questions only when the answers were already guaranteed to satisfy, and accepted each month a payment routed through his brother-in-law's landscaping company, in amounts small enough individually and plausible enough superficially that only someone with a forensic accountant's training and a federal warrants authority would ever know to look. The landscaping company did technically perform some landscaping. The brother-in-law did technically have a truck. These details had seemed important to Hoyt at the beginning and had stopped seeming important to him after the first year, by which point the monthly deposits had become something he had simply stopped thinking about, the way you stop thinking about a sound that has been present long enough to become part of the background. The money went different places for different people. Briggs had a boat registered in his cousin's name, a 22-foot fishing vessel that spent most of its time in a marina 40 miles south of Alderton, and that Briggs referred to as his cousin's boat in every conversation, while spending approximately every other weekend on it. Duval had renovated his kitchen twice in 3 years on a patrolman's salary, the kind of renovation that involved granite countertops and custom cabinetry, and a contractor who was paid in cash and asked no questions because the instructions had been clear. Cole, the youngest, had been making double car payments since his second year on the force, paying down a truck that cost considerably more than his annual salary suggested he should be financing. And the math of this had somehow never generated a question from anyone who might have been positioned to ask one. The one structural vulnerability in the entire arrangement, and Briggs was aware of it, had thought about it, had dismissed it with the confidence of a man whose confidence had never yet cost him anything, was that it only worked on people who believed they had no options. Every shop owner who had paid because they had concluded correctly, based on available evidence, that the systems designed to protect them had been redirected to protect the people threatening them, and that therefore they were alone, and that being alone meant being compliant. The arrangement had been calibrated to produce that conclusion, to make it feel not like a trap, but like a reality, and it had worked with impressive consistency across 34 businesses and 6 years. What Briggs had not accounted for, what he had no framework to account for, was the possibility that one of those shop owners might arrive at a different calculation entirely. He had noticed in a vague and unattended way that Gloria Washington had looked at him differently than the others had when he had asked about the receipt. There had been something in her eyes that did not match the responses he was accustomed to receiving in that moment. No fear, no calculation of survival odds, no flicker of the particular resignation that told him a person had already made peace with paying. There had been, instead, something that resembled, uncomfortably, assessment. He had walked out of her shop, turning that detail over in the back of his mind, the way you turn over a small stone you have found that does not quite match the ground around it. And then he had put it away, because he had always been right, and there was no reason to believe that was about to change. He was in this completely and catastrophically wrong. The shop was closed, and the street outside had gone to the particular quiet that Alderton settled into after 10 in the evening, when the last of the foot traffic had moved on, and even the convenience store 2 blocks over had dimmed its window lights, and Gloria was alone in the back room with the overhead bulb humming its single low note, and the smell of the day's coffee still present in the air like the memory of something warm. The back room was not a romantic space. It was a working space, practical and slightly chaotic in the way that back rooms earn over 19 years of active use. Cardboard boxes stacked with the logic of someone who knows exactly where everything is, but has never found the moment to make that logic apparent to anyone else. An old filing cabinet against the far wall, whose drawers no longer closed all the way because of an incident with a jammed hinge that she had meant to fix for approximately 3 years. A broken folding chair that she had meant to throw away for approximately 4. A bare overhead bulb that hummed and had been humming for so long she no longer heard it during the day, and only noticed it now in the quiet. She knelt beside the filing cabinet and pulled the metal box out from beneath a stack of old invoices and tax records, her hands moving through the familiar territory of the shelf without needing her eyes to guide them, because her hands had known where the box was even during the years when she had chosen to behave as though they did not. The box was flat and gray and unremarkable, the kind of thing that could sit in a back room for years without attracting anyone's attention, which was precisely why it sat there. She set it on her knee, and her hands rested on the lid for a moment without opening it, the way hands sometimes pause before opening a door to a room that has been closed for a long time, holding briefly in the uncertainty of whether the person who last walked out of that room still exists on the other side. She opened it. Beneath the folded cloth was a Delta Force beret. The fabric had gone soft from years of use, the color faded to something that was no longer quite the original and not quite anything else, and it was unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking for, which, in the 19 years she had lived in Alderton, had been precisely nobody. Beneath the beret were ribbons, a small stack of them, their colors still vivid, and a dog tag with edges that had been worn smooth from being turned between someone's fingers during long nights in places where sleep was either impossible or unwise. There was also a folded photograph that she did not open, not tonight, maybe not for a while yet. She lifted the beret out and held it in both hands. For a moment, the back room with its humming bulb and its cardboard boxes and its filing cabinet that would not close simply fell away. 22 years. That was the first thought, arriving not as a number but as a weight. She remembered the specific silence that settled over a team in the 60 seconds before a door opened onto darkness. A silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of an absolute concentration so total that sound seemed to agree to step back and wait. She remembered the smell of a briefing room at 3 a.m, bad coffee and marker on a whiteboard, and the particular kind of focused tension that belongs to people who have moved past fear into preparation, who have done the math on the risks and accepted the results and are now simply executing. She remembered the weight of a decision that cannot be undone, made in the span of a single breath in a context where the span of a breath was often all the time available. 22 years in uniform, 11 of them with Delta Force. Operations that never appeared in a newspaper, in a press briefing, in any public record or official acknowledgement. Missions planned in windowless rooms and executed in minutes that expanded under pressure into something that felt much longer, where every choice carried a consequence she would carry for the rest of her life, regardless of whether anyone outside a secure briefing room ever knew it had been made. She had led hostage rescue operations in which a single wrong decision was the difference between a family reunited at an airport and a family receiving a phone call they would never recover from. She had coordinated coalition forces across borders that existed only on documents carrying clearance levels that most of the people she knew in Alderton had no framework to imagine. She had once led an internal investigation into corruption within her own unit, had sat across a table from people who had once called her sister, and watched them try every available justification and excuse while the evidence closed around them the way water closes around something dropped into it slowly and then completely. That investigation had taught her things about how rot grows when nobody is watching, and about how to cut it out precisely and thoroughly without making the kind of noise that creates its own complications. Her file, sealed and classified, carried her name in the kind of reports that never leave secure rooms. She had earned things in that file that she had never mentioned to a single person in Alderton, not because she was ashamed of them, but because they belonged to a version of herself that she had decided to carry quietly, the way you carry something valuable that you are not trying to show anyone. She had left after a final mission that she allowed herself to think about only in outline, never in detail. A mission in which she had watched a person with authority use that authority not to protect the people in their care, but to punish someone who had inconvenienced them. Had watched it happen in real time, in a room where she had the rank to stop it, and the culture around her was communicating with absolute clarity that stopping it was not the expected choice. She stopped it anyway. And then she walked away from the only life she had known for 22 years, because she had looked at the people in that room and understood something about what she was willing to be part of and what she was not. She had come back to Alderton to build something small and honest, a place where the transactions were simple and the debts were clear, and the only complexity was the register that stuck on the third drawer. She had put the metal box in the back of the filing cabinet shelf, and she had given herself permission to become Gloria, from the corner the woman who remembered your coffee order and your father's surgery and the name of your daughter's college town. She was sitting on the floor of the back room now, the beret in both hands, the humming bulb above her casting its pale yellow light, and she was making a decision. It arrived the way the best decisions arrive, not as a dramatic turning point, not as a moment of high emotion, but as a quiet settling, something clicking into alignment with a solidity that left no room for doubt. She was not going to pay Carl Briggs $4,500. She was not going to close her green door. And she was not under any circumstances going to handle this the way he expected her to handle it. She set the beret gently on her knee and looked up at the humming light above her and breathed in the smell of the day's coffee and the cardboard and the familiar particular air of her own back room, and the decision sat in her chest like something that had always been there, only now acknowledged. For the 2 days following her decision, Gloria opened the shop, at the same time swept the sidewalk with the same broom, greeted every customer by name and with the same unhurried attention she had always given them, and gave no outward sign to anyone looking at her from the outside that anything had changed at all. She poured Mrs. Eleanor Teague's coffee with exactly 1 sugar. She waited without hurrying while Mr. Bernard Holt counted out his coins one at a time. She told Deshawn and Marcus and Bug that they had left the door open again exactly the way she always told them, and they said sorry in the distracted way teenagers say sorry about things they have no intention of changing, and she let them go. The shop looked and sounded and smelled the way it always did, and anyone watching would have seen a woman doing what she always did on any given day of the past 19 years. But in the hours before the shop opened, in the gray time before dawn, when Alderton was still quiet enough that she could hear the traffic light at the corner clicking through its cycles, she found herself doing things she had not done consciously in a very long time. She noted exits and sight lines when she moved through the front of the shop in the dim, pre-opening light, not aggressively, not anxiously, just with the automatic precision of someone whose training had wired that habit so deeply that when the habit's reason returned, the habit returned with it. She registered which shelves offered cover and which offered sight lines, and which positioned someone between a wall and an entrance in a way that was tactically disadvantageous. She watched the street through the front window each morning for 5 full minutes before she unlocked the door. She had always done this, always had her coffee and watched the street in the early light. But she noticed now that she was watching it differently, the way a map looks different once you know it contains information that is not printed on the surface. She was not planning violence. She had not planned violence in many years and had no intention of returning to it. But 22 years of training does not simply switch off because a person has replaced a rifle with a cash register and a classified briefing with a can of soup and some part of her. The part that had once kept teams alive and missions on track in places where the margin for error was measured in seconds, was already thinking 3 moves ahead of wherever Carl Briggs believed the game currently stood. On the second evening, after the last customer had gone and the shop was locked and the street outside was quiet, she sat down at the small desk in the back room and wrote an email. Not to a local newspaper, which she knew could be pressured. Not to the city council, whose relationship with the Alderton Police Department she had now thoroughly mapped. Not to the state attorney general's office, whose response to small-town complaints was, in her considered estimation, reliably slow and reliably insufficient. She sent it to the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, using credentials and a case reference number that she had memorized so long ago that her fingers found the sequence without any assistance from conscious memory, the way fingers find the keys of a familiar instrument. The email contained a summary of everything she had learned: dates, names, business addresses, payment amounts, where known, the pattern of inspections and citations, and padlocks. The internal affairs closure language, the timeline of each business's deterioration, laid out with the same clean precision she had once used to brief rooms full of people with stars on their shoulders. Each element labeled, each connection explained, the logic of the whole thing made visible without editorializing or emotion. At the end, a single, simple request that someone with appropriate clearance take a look. She sent it and went back to stacking the soup cans that had come in on the afternoon delivery, arranging them in the neat, even rows she had always arranged them in. The labels facing front, the heavier cans on the lower shelves, everything in its place. The register stuck on the third drawer. The teenagers from the Franklin apartments came in and bought their chips and left the door open behind them, and said sorry in the distracted way teenagers say sorry. The afternoon light moved across the linoleum floor the way it always moved in September, long and amber, and Mrs. Eleanor Teed came in for her afternoon coffee at 4:15 exactly as she always did, and Gloria made it with exactly 1 sugar and handed it across the counter. And they talked for a few minutes about the weather and about how the nights were getting shorter and about nothing in particular. Nothing looked different. Everything had changed. They came back on the morning of the third day without the pretense of purpose that had at least given the first visit the surface appearance of official business. And this time there was no courtesy, no performance of the helpful bureaucrat explaining the rules of a game he had invented. Briggs walked through the door and cracked his knuckles, both hands automatic, the gesture happening before he had fully cleared the entrance. And the sound of it carried differently in the empty morning shop, louder than Gloria had noticed before, the habit of a man so accustomed to his own authority that he announces it without knowing he is announcing it. He walked the aisles and swept products off the shelves with the back of his forearm, not breaking stride, not pausing to observe the result. The motion, casual and almost bored, the way a person walks through a space they consider already destroyed. Cans rolling and clanging on the linoleum, a glass jar of peach preserves shattering against the floor in a spray of amber and glass that spread across the aisle in a slow, glittering fan. Duval went directly to the security camera above the register, reached up without hesitation and pulled it from its mount, the mounting screws giving with a crack of splitting drywall, the wires trailing behind the device like torn nerves, and he set it, dropped it really, with enough contempt to constitute a drop, on the counter where it landed with a heavy clatter that made the register vibrate. Cole stood near the door and looked at the floor. Briggs threatened to arrest Gloria on a charge he invented in real time, a charge whose specifics shifted slightly each time he referenced it, the way invented things do. And his voice climbed as he moved through the shop, filling the space with the kind of authority that has always been made of volume rather than legitimacy. He was performing for an audience he believed was present, the intimidated audience he always performed for, the one that flinched and accommodated and eventually produced an envelope. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that a woman who had been standing near the back of the shop before the visit began, a regular customer who had come in for bread and had been in the middle of choosing between 2 loaves when the officers arrived, had quietly raised her phone and begun recording. She had positioned the device low against the edge of the shelf, the red indicator light tucked behind the fold of her jacket sleeve, and her hands were steady and the angle was clear, and every word that Briggs said in the next 4 minutes was traveling into a device that would carry it far beyond the walls of Washington's corner market. Briggs planted his boots wide in the center of the aisle, the broken glass crunching faintly under his weight, and announced to the shop, to Gloria, to the empty shelves, to whatever version of Alderton he believed he was addressing, that he was the law in this town, that he had always been the law in this town, that nobody had ever stopped him, that nobody was going to stop him, that the sooner Gloria Washington understood that reality, the better things were going to go for her. He said it with the complete confidence of a man who believed himself to be alone in his certainty, the confidence of someone who has repeated a true thing for so long that it has stopped requiring evidence. Gloria stood behind her counter and did not raise her hands, did not raise her voice, did not give him the satisfaction of watching anything break in her face. She stood with the stillness she had once held in the minute before a mission launched, the particular internal quiet that is not the absence of activity, but the concentration of it. And she looked at Carl Briggs and said quietly and without inflection that he had just said something very dangerous. Something in the quality of those words, or in the quality of the silence that held them, made Briggs stop. Not for long, not with any visible acknowledgement that he was stopping, but she saw it. The fractional pause, the almost imperceptible hesitation of a man who has walked forward his whole life and felt for one instant the ground shift slightly beneath his foot. Then he shook it off and laughed, and Duvall laughed with him, and Cole produced a sound that was adjacent to laughter, and they walked out, boots crunching through the broken glass and the amber preserve and the scattered rolling cans, the bell above the door ringing twice in their wake. Gloria waited until the sound of them had fully faded from the street before she moved. Then she went to the supply closet for the broom and the dustpan, and she began cleaning up the mess, picking up cans and restoring them to their shelves, sweeping the glass into a careful pile, absorbing the spilled preserves with paper towels. And she worked with the unhurried steadiness of a person who is cleaning up something temporary, who is not performing distress for anyone's benefit, because there is no one to perform it for, and who knows with a certainty that goes deeper than the current mess on the floor that this is not how the story ends. That evening, Briggs Duvall and Cole drove 2 miles from the precinct to a bar called the Rail Yard, a place with dim lighting and a back booth that had been their unofficial debrief location for the better part of 6 years. A booth worn smooth by the number of evenings they had spent in it, dividing up the week's collections and deciding what came next. The Rail Yard's clientele was sparse on Tuesday evenings and incurious on all evenings, which had always been among its primary professional virtues. Briggs slid into the booth first, set his beer down, cracked his knuckles with the meditative satisfaction of a man settling in for a conversation he is looking forward to, and began talking. He was in the particular expansive mood that came over him after what he considered a successful application of pressure, loose and warm and generous in the way that men sometimes become when they believe all the difficult variables have been resolved and nothing remains but to enjoy the resolution. He told Duvall and Cole that Gloria Washington was done, that she just did not know it yet, that the behavior pattern was unmistakable. A person who still had options made noise, immediately went to a lawyer or a news station or a city council member within hours, and the ones who went quiet after a second visit had already made their calculation and accepted their position in the arrangement. The fact that she had not called anyone, as far as he could tell, meant she was processing, and the fact that she was processing meant she was moving toward compliance, and compliance was the only outcome that had ever existed in this situation. He talked about the boat, his cousin's boat, he was careful to say, with the ease of a man who has told a story so many times that the details have been polished smooth, and about how the motor needed replacing before the season ended, and about how $4,500 was going to go a long way toward solving that particular problem. He told Duvall that the kitchen renovation they had discussed, the countertops and the cabinet refinishing, was going to happen before Christmas now. A little Christmas bonus from the last holdout on the block finally coming around. Duvall raised his beer with the contentment of a man whose future has just been made more comfortable by someone else's compliance. Then Briggs laughed and shook his head, and said he wished he could have seen her face when she went to clean up all those cans he knocked off the shelves. He said she had swept them up herself. He was willing to bet anything on it, because that was what people like her did. They swept up the mess, and they convinced themselves it was dignified, and then they paid the fee because at the end of the day, a shop was a shop, and he was a badge, and those two things did not have an equal outcome. He said it with relish, the specific pleasure of a man recounting something he is proud of, and Duvall laughed and Cole did not, but Cole did not say anything either. He talked about Captain Mason Hoyt, about how Hoyt had a city council connection who had been making noise about a community policing commendation, a formal recognition of the department's commitment to neighborhood safety, which was in the context of this particular conversation. Funny in a way that none of them bothered to articulate, because articulating it would have required thinking about it slightly more directly than any of them wanted to. Cole, who was on his second beer and had been quiet for most of the conversation, said, "What if she went to the FBI?" He said it carefully, like a person who knows the question might not be welcome, but feels the professional obligation to ask it anyway. Briggs laughed. He set his beer down and cracked his knuckles, and laughed the unhurried laugh of a man entertaining an idea he finds more amusing than threatening. He said the FBI did not come to Alderton, Georgia for a corner store owner with a complaint about a fee. He said the only federal presence that had passed through Alderton in his 11 years on the force was a postal inspector looking for a missing package. He said that federal agencies operated on priorities, and that a small-town business owner with a grievance about a safety assessment was approximately as high on those priorities as a noise complaint from a cul-de-sac, which was to say, not very high at all. Duvall said something that Briggs would later, in the long retrospective of a federal holding cell, consider the closest anyone in that booth had come to an accurate assessment of the situation. Duvall said that the Washington woman had looked at them differently than the others had, that there was something in her eyes during the first visit that he had not been able to place, something that did not match the pattern. He said it without quite knowing what he was saying, which was the problem. Briggs waved it off. He said that was dignity, and dignity was the most expensive thing a person like her could carry, and sooner or later, everyone sold it for something more practical. He raised his glass in the amber light of the back booth, and Duvall raised his, and Cole, after a moment, raised his. And the three of them drank to the resolution of the Washington situation, and to the boat motor, and to the kitchen renovation, and to nothing in particular, and to everything in general. They were comfortable and warm, and entirely, perfectly, catastrophically convinced that they had won. In the back room of Washington's Corner Market, 3 blocks away, Gloria's sent email had been sitting in the Defense Criminal Investigative Service's secure intake system for 41 hours, and an analyst was about to arrive at her desk for the morning shift and open it. And what she was about to see was going to make her push back from her desk and reach for her phone before she had finished reading the first paragraph. But in the rail yard's back booth in the amber light, with the beer and the plans, and the comfortable certainty of men who had been right about everything for 11 years, none of that existed yet. They finished their drinks and left a cash tip, and drove home through the quiet streets of Alderton. And the night was mild, and the roads were empty, and everything as far as any of them could tell was exactly as it should be. The analyst who opened Gloria's email at 7:43 on a Wednesday morning had been working intake at the Defense Criminal Investigative Service for 6 years, which meant she had developed a calibrated sense of what a civilian complaint looked like. Its shape, its vocabulary, its level of detail, the specific texture of genuine distress versus organized grievance. And she recognized within the first paragraph that what she was reading did not match any of those patterns. By the third paragraph, she had stopped scrolling and started reading with both hands flat on the desk and her morning coffee going cold beside the keyboard, because the document she was looking at had the structure and the precision of a professional intelligence summary, and the case reference number attached to it was pulling up a file that was generating clearance verification requests she had never, in 6 years, seen the system produce for a civilian complaint. She pulled up the name. She pulled up the service record. She sat very still for a moment, looking at what was on her screen, and then she reached for her phone and called her supervisor, and the call lasted 4 minutes, and by the end of it her supervisor was calling someone else, and by mid-morning the chain of those calls had reached a level where each new voice on the line was measurably more careful and precise than the voice before it. The kind of careful precision that surfaces when experienced people recognize that what has arrived on their desk is not the routine thing it appeared to be at first. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit was looped in before noon. The Department of Defense followed by the next morning. The Office of the Inspector General requested a full briefing before 2 sunsets had passed. And on the third day, a secure conference room in a federal building 3 states from Alderton, Georgia, held a table of people who had never met each other before that afternoon, representing agencies whose usual contact with each other was formal and infrequent. All of them present because one woman in a small corner market had sent one email from a backroom desk at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Special Agent Patricia Cole of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit took the lead. A sharp and methodical woman in her early 40s who had spent the better part of her career following money through the kinds of financial structures designed specifically to prevent people like her from following it, and who had, over those years, developed an eye for the difference between a credible complaint and a credible complaint with extraordinary supporting documentation. She read Gloria's summary twice, made 3 annotations, and told the room that the intake document alone was the cleanest civilian submission she had ever processed, and that the person who wrote it had done their advance work with a precision that was going to make the investigative phase considerably less complicated than public corruption cases usually were. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Whitfield was assigned to the case, a careful, deliberate man in his 50s who operated without theatrical urgency and with the methodical confidence of someone who has built enough cases to know that the difference between a conviction and an acquittal usually comes down to the quality of the preparation, and who recognized, looking at the documentation Gloria had provided, that the preparation here was excellent. A federal wiretap warrant was obtained within 48 hours, signed by a federal magistrate judge 2 states over, bypassing the local court structure entirely, authorized under the Hobbs Act and the civil rights provisions of Title 18, Section 242. The language of the warrant was precise, and the scope was broad enough to catch everything that needed catching, and the local court's proximity to the people being investigated was noted in the application and addressed preemptively, which was something Briggs and Hoyt would later realize they should have been more concerned about, but had never imagined was necessary to consider. The investigators who began pulling threads in the first 48 hours found more than the email had described, which was saying something given the quality of the email. 34 businesses confirmed some with records going back nearly 6 years. Shell accounts linked to relatives of officers who had never held a position that would explain their bank balance. Assets documented across several names. A boat registered to Briggs's cousin that a forensic accountant flagged within hours of finding the registration. Duvall's kitchen renovation traced to a contractor whose cash payment records corresponded almost exactly to a series of withdrawals from an account belonging to an LLC whose only apparent business was not appearing in any business database. Captain Hoyt's arrangement with the landscaping company emerged from bank records within the first day, the payment structure so thinly disguised that the forensic accountant reportedly described it in a message to a colleague as aggressively optimistic in its assumption that no one would ever look. Special Agent Patricia Cole met Gloria in the back room of the shop on a Thursday afternoon, the door locked, the close sign in the window, the 2 of them sitting across the small desk from each other, with the overhead bulb humming between them. The conversation was brief and efficient, and entirely without performance. Cole explained what the operation required. Gloria listened without interrupting, asked 2 questions, both specific, both technical, and nodded once when Cole finished. She had been in rooms like this before. The furniture was different, the stakes were local rather than international. Everything else was familiar. The plan required Gloria to do something that ran against the instinct she had spent 19 years in Alderton cultivating. It required her to appear credibly and convincingly to have broken. To call Briggs and arrange the payment in a voice that carried the specific defeated quality of a person who has looked at their options and found them insufficient. She made the call on a Friday afternoon from behind her counter with the shop empty and the street quiet outside, and Agent Cole's team already positioned 2 blocks away in a vehicle whose exterior was indistinguishable from a plumbing supply delivery truck. Briggs answered on the second ring, and his voice in the first syllable told her everything she needed to know about his state of mind. Loose and easy and just barely containing a satisfaction he was trying not to telegraph too obviously. The voice of a man who had been right about something he was very pleased to have been right about. She told him she would have the money on Monday. He said that was good thinking on her part. She said she would have it ready at the shop whenever worked for him. He said Monday afternoon worked fine, and that she was making the smart choice, and that things would go smoothly now that they were on the same page. She said she understood. She thanked him. The thanking him was the hardest part. Every bill in the envelope had been prepared by Agent Cole's team. Each one marked its serial number logged into a federal database that would flag the bill the moment it attempted to enter any banking system. A federal camera had been mounted in the awning of the dry cleaner across the street 2 nights before the exchange, positioned with a precision that produced a clean sight line to the entrance and counter of Washington's corner market, from an angle that would survive any challenge to its admissibility. And sewn into the left seam of Gloria's jacket, so small that it created no visible profile in the fabric, was a microphone that was at this moment carrying ambient sound to a set of headphones in the surveillance vehicle 2 blocks away, where 3 members of Agent Cole's team were sitting with pens moving across notepads and recording equipment running. Briggs arrived on Monday at 2:15 alone. He had sent Duvall and Cole on separate patrol assignments that morning, which Agent Cole noted in her case log as consistent with a principal who makes his personal collections without witnesses who might later need to be managed. He walked through the green door and the bell rang once, and he cracked his knuckles before the sound of the bell had finished carrying the habit, arriving before any other part of him had settled into the room. He was in good spirits. He moved through the shop with the ease of a man who has stopped thinking of a space as belonging to someone else, and he came to the counter and looked at the envelope that Gloria had placed there, and he picked it up with the casual confidence of a man collecting something that has always been his. He counted the bills once with his thumb, a single fast riffle, the practiced motion of someone who has handled enough envelopes in enough back rooms and quiet corners that the count has become automatic, a reflex rather than a precaution. He folded the envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket and pressed it flat, and looked at Gloria across the counter with the particular expression of a man who considers a negotiation concluded. And then he told her, almost as an afterthought, the way a person delivers a postscript to a letter whose main point has already been made, that nobody had ever stopped him, that Alderton was his city, and had always been his city, and would be his city long after this shop was a memory and she was someone else's problem. He said it with the comfort of a man who believes he is speaking only to the person in front of him, which was the last significant error of his professional life. Gloria looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon light was coming through the front window at a low angle, catching the edge of his badge, throwing a thin, bright line across the counter between them. And she asked him simply whether he was certain of that. The flicker crossed his face again, the same fractional hesitation she had seen twice before. The same, almost noticing of something that did not quite fit, and it lasted exactly as long as it had the previous times, a fraction of a second. And then he laughed and walked out through the green door for the last time, the bell ringing once behind him, clear and bright and final. In the surveillance vehicle 2 blocks away, Agent Cole pressed a button on her recording console and spoke into a secure phone. She said they had it. Clean audio, clean video, marked currency transferred. The echo line recorded verbatim. She said they were ready to move. The person on the other end of the line authorized the next phase in 2 words. Gloria locked the front door and put up the closed sign and went to the back room and made a cup of coffee and sat at the small desk with the humming bulb above her and the familiar smell of the shop around her. And she drank the coffee slowly in the quiet, and she felt not triumph, not excitement, but the particular still calm of someone who has done what needed doing and is now simply in the interval before the doing becomes visible. At 5:47 in the morning, while Alderton was still in the gray interval between night and day, before the first coffee shop had opened, and before the first delivery truck had made its first stop, the federal operation moved into position with the kind of coordinated quiet that is the product of extensive planning, applied by people who understand that the difference between a successful raid and a compromised one is often measured in minutes and sometimes in seconds. Unmarked vehicles, dark-colored, unremarkable, the kind of vehicles that could sit on a residential street without generating a second look, rolled to their positions from 3 different directions simultaneously. And the officers and agents inside them moved when they were supposed to move, and stopped when they were supposed to stop, and communicated in the clipped, precise shorthand of people who have rehearsed the sequence and are now executing it. The Alderton Police Department was sealed within 6 minutes of first contact. Federal agents alongside Department of Justice investigators and state police units announced themselves at every entrance simultaneously, voices flat and procedural, and carrying the particular authority of people who have a warrant that is not subject to negotiation. Officers who had reported for the early shift were ordered to stand down, instructed to set their weapons on the nearest horizontal surface, and directed to the parking lot while the building was secured. Search warrants were read aloud in the parking lot as the morning light began to gray the edges of the sky, the words carrying clearly in the early air, each officer hearing his own department described in federal legal language, which is a specific and clarifying experience. Inside, the search was methodical and thorough and without theater. No rushing, no shouting, no unnecessary drama. Just trained professionals moving room to room in a sequence that had been mapped from building plans obtained 3 weeks earlier. In the records room on the second floor, behind a section of false panel that had been identified through a combination of building plan discrepancy analysis and a tip from Officer Randy Cole, who had by this point been talking to Agent Cole's team for 36 hours, they found the safe. Its door was forced by a federal locksmith in 4 minutes, and inside were stacks of unmarked cash, rubber-banded in bundles of 500. The rubber bands tight and fresh, the bills clean and clearly handled recently. More cash than the safe's existence had suggested, more than even the forensic accountant's model had predicted. Enough that the agent who opened the safe door said nothing for a moment, and simply looked. The ledgers were found in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet in Briggs's office, written in a notation so simple it had apparently not occurred to its author that simplicity was not the same as security. Names, abbreviated amounts in round numbers, dates in a format that matched exactly with the business owner's testimony about payment schedules. The ledger covered 5 years and 11 months and contained 143 entries. Phones were bagged, hard drives were pulled. An external account accessed through a tablet found in Captain Hoyt's bottom drawer turned out to contain 18 months of transaction records connecting directly to the landscaping company, which connected to Hoyt's brother-in-law, which connected to a pattern of regular deposits that a forensic accountant would later describe in court as the most straightforward money laundering she had encountered in 14 years of practice, by which she meant that it was not very sophisticated, and that the person who designed it had perhaps relied somewhat heavily on the assumption that no one would ever look. Officer Randy Cole was found in the parking lot sitting in his personal vehicle, not his cruiser, at a few minutes before 6 in the morning, apparently having arrived for his shift and then been unable to make himself go inside. He did not resist when Agent Cole approached his window. He had his own hands already visible on the steering wheel, the way a person positions their hands when they want to communicate that they are not a problem, that they have already decided to be cooperative, that whatever is happening, they would like to be on the side of it, that involves the least possible amount of the next several decades of their life being spent in a specific kind of building. He was already talking before Agent Cole had finished identifying herself, and the names and dates he provided in the next 12 minutes would fill 2 pages of notes and become a central exhibit in the federal prosecution. Pete Duvall was arrested at a gas station on the eastern edge of town where he had stopped for coffee on his way in. The agent who approached him reported that Duvall's coffee cup hit the concrete when she identified herself, the plastic lid bouncing once and rolling away, the coffee spreading in a dark fan across the pavement, and Duvall watched it go with the expression of a man watching something more than a cup of coffee spill. He did not resist. He asked once if there was any chance this was a mistake. The agent told him there was not. Captain Mason Hoyt was taken at his home at 6:12, still in the terry cloth bathrobe he wore on mornings when he did not have to be at the precinct until 8. His wife standing in the kitchen doorway with her hands pressed together in front of her, watching 2 federal agents walk her husbands down the front path to a waiting vehicle. Hoyt was carrying a folder when they arrived, the bank records from the landscaping company which he had apparently been reviewing at the kitchen table, perhaps conducting some version of the review that comes when a man senses something is wrong, but has not yet accepted that wrong is the word for it. Briggs was at the precinct when they came for him. He was in his office, in uniform, sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee and the day's schedule in front of him, apparently conducting an ordinary Tuesday morning in the complete belief that this was an ordinary Tuesday morning. The agents who came through his office door found him in that posture, coffee in hand, schedule open, and watched the transformation happen in real time as the reality of what was occurring resolved itself from the background noise of an impossible idea into the foreground clarity of an actual event. He stood up from his desk, and by reflex, the deepest, most involuntary kind of reflex, the kind that happens below the level of any decision. He cracked his knuckles, both hands. The gesture automatic, the habit executing itself without any signal from a person who was no longer in the kind of situation where the gesture meant what it had always meant. He was led out of the building in handcuffs through the parking lot, where his officers were standing in a loose cluster watching, and he kept asking, in a voice that lost volume with each repetition, who had done this? Who had turned? Who had gone to the federal government about a routine arrangement in a small Georgia town? As if the answer could not possibly be the woman on the corner who sold coffee and candy and canned soup and remembered everyone's name. As if nothing about her, not her modest green door or her sticking register or her 19 years of quiet, had ever given him a single reason to look twice in her direction. He was still asking when the helicopter arrived. The sound reached the parking lot before the helicopter was visible above the rooftops. The low, rhythmic beating of rotor blades cutting through morning air growing from the edge of hearing to the center of it. Dust and small loose grit beginning to lift from the cracked asphalt in concentric, trembling rings as the aircraft descended, its shadow preceding it across the faces of the people standing in the lot below. Federal agents and state police officers and the remaining Alderton officers all looked up at the same moment, in the instinctive way people look up at approaching sound, and the helicopter came down with the precise, unhurried competence of a pilot who has done this many times in far more complicated situations. The doors opened. The first thing visible was the shoe. Not a casual shoe, not a sneaker. A low-heeled dress shoe with a mirror polish that caught the morning light and threw it back without apology. The kind of polish that takes time and intention and says something specific about the person who applied it. It touched the asphalt of the parking lot with a deliberate, measured step, followed by a second shoe, exactly as precise. Then came the trousers, dark navy, pressed to a crease that could have cut paper. And then the jacket, its brass buttons catching the early sun one by one as the figure descended from the aircraft. Each button a small point of light in the gray morning. The ribbons came into view next, a row of them across the left chest, their colors vivid and specific, each one a record of something done somewhere in conditions that most people in that parking lot would never encounter. And then Gloria Mae Washington stepped fully onto the pavement of the Alderton Police Department and straightened to her full height, and the morning light seemed to settle around her the way light settles around something it recognizes, and the weight of 22 years was visible in every line of how she carried herself. She was not wearing the apron with the ink stain near the left pocket. She was not wearing the plain clothes she wore when she swept the sidewalk each morning. She was wearing a Delta Force dress uniform pressed to a precision that suggested someone who had not forgotten in 19 years of civilian life exactly how such things were supposed to look. Several of the senior officers in the parking lot, by pure and unmediated muscle memory, straightened their backs and began the motion of a salute before any conscious thought had formed to authorize or prevent it. The gesture started and arrested itself at different points in different people, some of them completing it, some of them catching themselves halfway, but all of them beginning it. The body's recognition of the uniform arriving ahead of the mind's processing of the situation. Carl Briggs, standing with his cuffed hands in front of him between two federal agents, went still. The color left his face in the specific way that is different from ordinary pallor, not the gradual change of cold or sickness, but the sudden evacuating rush of blood when the body registers something the mind is still trying to refuse. His jaw, for the first time anyone observing him had ever seen, unclenched. His mouth opened slightly. His hands, still cuffed at the wrists, went motionless, and the knuckle-cracking reflex, the reflex that had preceded every performance of authority for 11 years, did not come. There was nothing left to perform it for. He remembered it all in one compressed and devastating second, not as a sequence, but as a simultaneous arrival, every detail at once, the way certain memories return, not one piece at a time, but all together, the whole scene collapsing back into the present as a single coherent unit. The shop on a Tuesday afternoon. The coffee cup he had set on her counter without asking. her wiping her hands on the towel and folding it once and setting it down, her asking about the receipt, the stillness in her voice when she told him he had just said something very dangerous, the specific quality of her eyes when she looked at him, not afraid, not calculating survival odds, looking at him the way a person looks at something they are in the process of accurately assessing. And over it all, in his own voice, the thing he had said directly into the microphone sewn into her jacket seam. Nobody has ever stopped me, and nobody ever will. Gloria found him in the crowd without having to search for him. She moved through the parking lot with the unhurried direct bearing of someone who has walked into rooms far more dangerous than this one and has never found it useful to approach them sideways. And when she found Briggs among the people standing in the lot, she looked at him. Not with anger. Anger would have been too animated, too responsive to him, would have granted him too much ongoing significance. Not with triumph. Triumph would have been premature, and she had never been the kind of person who celebrated before the work was fully done. She looked at him with the same expression she had worn on the other side of her counter on the very first day he walked through her door, calm, direct, completely unafraid, and entirely accurate. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds, everything that needed to be communicated between them was communicated without a word. Then she looked away toward Agent Cole, and the connection was simply over, the way things are over when they are actually over, and not just temporarily suspended. Agent Cole stepped forward and addressed the officers assembled in the lot, in a voice clear enough to be heard by everyone present, and she explained, plainly, without elaboration, what Gloria's service record contained. The operations that existed in no public document. The missions that most of the people standing in this parking lot would never be cleared to read about. The specific and particular nature of the authority that Carl Briggs had walked into a corner shop and attempted to override with a demand for $4,500. The parking lot was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. There were sounds, radios, and distant traffic, and the idling of engines. But the human component of the noise had stopped every officer processing in their own way the particular information of what had been allowed to happen in this department, and to whom. An older officer near the far edge of the lot, a man with the look of someone who had worked under 3 different chiefs and had grown steadily number with each passing year to the arrangement he had chosen not to examine too closely, leaned toward the younger officer beside him and said, quietly enough that it barely carried, that he had always known a day like this would come. That a debt, built on fear, always came due eventually, one way or another. The younger officer beside him said nothing. He was looking at Gloria Washington, and his expression was one that had no specific name. Not guilt, exactly, not shame, exactly, but something in the territory between them that is the particular emotional experience of understanding, too late, what you have been part of. Briggs was placed into the federal transport vehicle. His protests reduced themselves step by step from something that had been arguments to something that had been objections to something that was simply noise, and then to nothing at all. The bravado that had carried him through 11 years of accumulating certainties collapsing from the bottom up, until there was nothing left of it. The door of the vehicle closed, and he was gone. And the parking lot began the process of becoming just a parking lot again, with the work of the morning's operation continuing around the space where he had stood. Gloria turned back to Agent Cole, and they spoke for a few minutes about next steps, schedules, what the coming weeks would require. Then Gloria thanked her, shook her hand, and walked to the vehicle that would take her back to the corner of the block where the green door was waiting. The hinges in need of their familiar morning creak, the register ready to stick on the 3rd drawer. Mrs. Eleanor Teague's coffee needing to be made with exactly 1 sugar at 7:20. She had a shop to open. The federal courthouse in which the United States of America versus Carl Briggs and associated defendants was heard was a different kind of room from the rooms that had produced this case. Not the back room of a corner market, not the false-paneled records room of a compromised police department, not a surveillance vehicle on a quiet street in Alderton, but a room built specifically for the purpose of making things official and permanent, with marble floors and vaulted ceilings, and the federal seal behind the bench carrying the particular weight of an authority that had not been invented by the people in the room and could not be redistributed by them. It smelled of old paper and institutional air conditioning, and the specific formality of a place where language is chosen with care because it will be written down and kept. Briggs sat at the defense table in a gray suit that did not fit him the way his uniform had. It sat on him slightly wrong across the shoulders, slightly loose at the waist. The suit of a man who has lost weight and not yet acknowledged it in his wardrobe. And he looked like what he was, which was a man who had been removed from the context that gave him his size, and was discovering that without that context, he was considerably smaller than he had believed. He had been in federal custody for 3 months awaiting trial. He had lost the bearing that had always preceded him into rooms. He still had the jaw, still had the habit of clenching it, but the clenching now looked like tension rather than authority, and that was a meaningful difference. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Whitfield approached the case the way he approached every case, which was without drama and without rushing, and with the complete confidence of someone who has constructed a building and knows exactly which walls are load-bearing. He presented the evidence in sequence, each piece placed with the care of someone who understands that a jury follows logic better than it follows passion, and that a case built on evidence rather than emotion is considerably harder to dismantle on appeal. The ledgers came first, the 143 entries in their simple notation displayed on the courtroom monitors and printed in the jury packets. Each entry cross-referenced with bank records and business owner testimony until the abstraction of a ledger became the concrete reality of a restaurant that closed and a hair salon that went dark and a man who watched someone invent a violation on a piece of official paper in front of him and could not say the word lie. The marked bills came next, their serial numbers confirmed against the federal database. The exchange itself documented on 2 independent recording systems. The audio from the microphone in Gloria's jacket played through the courtroom sound system at a volume that filled the room with Briggs's own voice. Loose, confident, the voice of a man completely certain of his position, saying the words that he had said in what he believed was the private space of a small corner shop on a Tuesday afternoon, saying that nobody had ever stopped him, that Alderton was his city, that it would be his city long after Gloria Washington was gone. The words filled the courtroom and settled into the silence that followed them, and in that silence, the jury foreperson wrote something in her notebook without being prompted, and 2 other jurors exchanged a glance that said something neither of them said aloud. Raymond Fuller took the witness stand and testified with his large, careful hands flat on the ledge of the witness box, pressed there as they had been pressed on the table in his darkened dining room. He told the story in order: the first visit, the climbing number, the internal affairs closure, the Wednesday in March. And his voice was steady, the kind of steadiness that belongs to people who have rehearsed a truth so many times in private that its public delivery has gone smooth. When he described the morning he locked the restaurant door for the last time and stood on the sidewalk before getting in his car, 2 of the jurors were looking at their hands. Darnell Price testified about the fabricated inspection, and the moment that held the courtroom most completely still was the moment he described watching the officer write the violation onto the official form without looking at the structure he was allegedly inspecting, writing it with the ease of someone completing a predetermined task, and Darnell knowing with complete certainty that what he was watching was a lie, and being equally certain that saying so would make everything immediately worse. He said that what had been taken from him was not only the money or the mechanic he lost, or the months of reduced operation. He said what had been taken from him was the assumption he had carried his whole working life, that if you built something real and kept it honest, the systems around you would at minimum leave it alone. Lucia Vargas testified by video from another city, her face on the courtroom monitor, looking older than the photographs in the file, and she described her attempt to organize a collective complaint and what had followed within the week. And she said that what she wanted the jury to understand was that she had not been afraid of Briggs personally when she first encountered him. She had been afraid of the structure around him, the arrangement that converted every official process into an instrument of enforcement that made a noise complaint arrive without a name and a fire violation appear without a fire. She said that a single corrupt officer was something you could fight. What she had encountered was something that had been built to be unfightable, and she had concluded, incorrectly as it turned out, that she was right about that. Officer Randy Cole's testimony covered 3 hours on the stand. He did not look at Briggs once during those 3 hours. He described the arrangement as he had known it from the inside. The route schedule, the collection protocol, the way complaints were flagged internally before they could leave the building. The specific language that Captain Hoyt used when he wanted something handled without leaving a paper trail in his own handwriting. He described the culture of assumption in the department, the way certain behaviors had been normalized through repetition until they ceased to register as behaviors at all, becoming instead simply the shape of how things were. He said at one point that he had known from very early in his time on the force that something was wrong, and that he had told himself that knowing it and not participating in the worst of it was a sufficient position to occupy, and that he understood now that it was not. Captain Mason Hoyt, who had accepted a cooperation agreement in exchange for a reduced charge, confirmed the financial structure from the inside. The landscaping company, the routing the monthly amounts, the political coverage he had provided in exchange for his share. He testified with the expression of a man who has already suffered the primary consequence of his actions and is now in the secondary consequence of describing them, which is its own particular form of sustained humiliation. He said on direct examination that he had understood from the beginning that what he was participating in was wrong, and that he had made a calculation that it was manageable, and that he had been wrong about the calculation, and that he had been wrong in a way that cost a great many people a great many things that they should never have had to lose. The defense had almost nothing. The evidence had not left gaps, and the gaps it had not left were the gaps a defense needs. Whitfield played the recording one final time in his closing, and he played only the 62 seconds that contained the exchange. Not the whole conversation, not the count of the bills or the arrangements for delivery. Just the moment at the end when Briggs had folded the envelope into his jacket and turned to Gloria and delivered almost as a postscript the thing that had been building toward this courtroom since the first afternoon he walked through her green door. The courtroom sound system carried his voice into every corner of the room. The ease of it, the comfort, the complete absence of any awareness that the words were traveling anywhere other than across a shop counter to a woman he believed had no options and no recourse and nowhere to take what she was hearing. Nobody has ever stopped me. Alderton is my city. It will be my city long after you are gone. The words sat in the courtroom silence for a moment after the recording ended. Then Whitfield called up the footage from the customer's phone, the video from the second visit, and played it after the audio without transition, without comment, without any bridge between them. The jury watched Briggs move through the shop with the back of his forearm products falling and rolling. They watched Duval reach up and pull the camera from its mount. They watched Briggs plant his boots wide in the aisle and announce to the shop that he was the law, the same voice that had just filled the room from the audio recording, the same register, the same absolute confidence. Then Whitfield stopped the video and said to the jury that the only question they needed to answer was whether the man they had just heard in that recording and seen in that footage was a public servant doing his job. And he sat down. Gloria was in the second row of the gallery. She had been in the second row every day of the trial with her leather portfolio on her knee, and her posture, the same posture it had always been, the posture of someone paying careful attention without performing the paying of it. She did not watch the screen during the playback of the recording. She watched the jury the way she had watched rooms her whole working life, reading the subtle language of people whose words were not yet available. She read the foreperson's face and two of the back row jurors and the older man in the third seat of the front row who had been the most consistent in his attention throughout the trial. And what she saw in those four faces told her what she needed to know about how this was going to end. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes, which in the context of a federal public corruption case with the volume and quality of evidence that had been presented was the deliberative equivalent of very little time at all. They came back in the late afternoon, the light through the courthouse windows going amber, and they delivered their verdict in the flat, procedural cadence of people who have made a decision and are now making it official. Guilty on all counts. The Honorable Sandra Reeves had been on the federal bench for 16 years and had the face of someone who had spent those 16 years in regular contact with the full range of what human beings do to each other, and had never found the contact surprising, only consistently instructive. She was precise and economical in her language, not given to oratory or spectacle, and she ran her courtroom the way careful people run things they care about, without waste, without theater, and with a thoroughness that left no relevant question unaddressed. The courtroom was full for the sentencing. Every bench was occupied, and the people occupying them were mostly people who had not been able to fill benches freely for some time. Shop owners and their families, and the people who had worked for them, and the neighbors who had watched storefronts go dark one by one, and understood that something was wrong but had not known what to do with that understanding. They sat shoulder to shoulder in a silence that was entirely different from the silence they had carried through the years of the arrangement. That silence had been the silence of suppression of things that needed to be said being held deliberately back. This silence was the silence of attention of people who had shown up to hear something they had waited a long time to hear. Judge Reeves addressed Briggs before she read the sentence, and she did so in the measured, direct way of a person who has decided exactly what needs to be said and has no interest in embellishing it. She said that he had been given a badge and a uniform and the authority that comes with them, authority that exists for the specific purpose of protecting the people who are least able to protect themselves. She said that he had taken that authority and converted it deliberately and over many years into a mechanism of extraction, using the weight of the state to take from people who had built something honest with their own hands and their own years and their own early mornings. She said that he had done this not in a moment of weakness or poor judgment, but as a sustained practice, organized and maintained with care, and that the organized and sustained nature of it was an aggravating factor that the court had weighed carefully. She said that the fact that he had believed himself untouchable was not a mitigating circumstance, but an element of the offense. The belief that the law did not apply to the people sworn to enforce it was not a personal failing separate from the crime. It was the crime. She sentenced Carl Briggs to 168 months in federal prison. 14 years. She noted for the record that his pension, 11 years of accumulated benefits, was immediately forfeited and would be liquidated by court order, the proceeds directed to the restitution fund established for the victims of the scheme. She read the names of the recipient businesses into the record: the Sunrise Bakery, Alderton Family Pharmacy, Darnell Price's Auto Repair Shop, Raymond Fuller's Restaurant, Lucia Vargas's Hair Salon, and 29 other businesses across 6 years, and she read them one by one, each name a separate entry in the permanent record of what had been taken and what was now, to the extent that it could be, being returned. Pete Duvall received 96 months, 8 years, and his pension was stripped. Randy Cole, whose cooperation had been extensive and whose information had materially advanced the prosecution, received a reduced sentence of 36 months with supervised release and a permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification. Mason Hoyt, by virtue of his cooperation agreement, received 120 months, 10 years, with full forfeiture of his pension and the court-ordered dissolution of his brother-in-law's landscaping company. The gavel came down once. The sound of it was not dramatic. It was a small, sharp, entirely ordinary sound, the sound of a wooden object striking a wooden surface. But it carried in the courtroom the way sounds carry when a room has been waiting for them, and in the rows of benches a sound moved through the gathered people that was not quite applause and not quite weeping, and was perhaps most accurately described as the sound of lungs releasing air that had been held for a long time. Briggs stood as the marshals approached because standing was what the protocol required. His jaw was set in its familiar clench, but when the judge read the words 14 years, something happened below the surface. His hands in their cuffs pressed together once hard and then went limp, and the jaw held, but the eyes did not, going briefly involuntarily wide before closing once and resettling into the careful blankness of a man who has decided not to give the room the satisfaction of watching him break. The knuckle-cracking reflex did not come. It had not come once since the morning in the parking lot, as though whatever engine had driven the habit for 11 years had finally recognized that there was nothing left to maintain. The marshals turned him toward the gallery as protocol required before moving him out, and for a moment, one moment, brief and irreversible, his eyes found Gloria Washington in the second row. She did not smile. She did not call out. She looked at him with the same expression she had worn behind her counter on the first afternoon he walked through her door, and on the second afternoon, and in the parking lot of the precinct, and in this courtroom every day of the trial. Calm, direct, unafraid, completely accurate. And she gave him a single, slow nod. Not triumph, not pity, the acknowledgement of a debt that has been paid in full, recorded, and closed. Then she picked up her leather portfolio from the bench beside her, stood, and walked out of the courtroom, through the center aisle, past the rows of people who had come to witness this, and through the heavy doors, and out into the afternoon. She had a shop to open tomorrow morning. Carl Briggs was processed into federal custody at a correctional facility 4 hours from Alderton on a Tuesday morning, and the intake officer who handed him his uniform and his number and his bunk assignment recognized his name from the news coverage and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of commentary. He was thinner than his booking photo, and without his uniform he occupied space differently, less of it and less certainly. The boat his cousin had been registering in the marina 40 miles south sat under a blue federal impound tarp, salt-rusted, going nowhere. In the first week, he sat on the edge of his bunk in the quiet after lights out and reached for his knuckles by reflex. The old habit arriving from somewhere below, thought, and then stopped and looked at his hands for a long time in the dark, and the sound did not come again. Nobody in Alderton, Georgia would say his name in the same sentence as the word law again. The Alderton Police Department was rebuilt almost from the ground up under a new chief brought in from outside the county. The roster reconstituted through a process that took months and left almost nothing of the previous structure intact. The restitution fund began paying out, checks arriving in mailboxes that had grown accustomed to nothing but bills and bad news, and Raymond Fuller reopened his restaurant with fresh paint on the walls and a new sign above the door, and on opening night, he set a single reserved table near the window and placed a small card on it that read only, "Thank you." And he never told anyone exactly who it was meant for, and nobody asked. Darnell Price stood in the doorway of his garage bay on the first morning of full operation, arms crossed, watching the first truck roll in, and allowed himself a smile he did not explain to anyone. The Sunrise Bakery dropped its prices to what they had been 2 years before. The pharmacy went back to its old hours. The owners stopped glancing at the door each time the bell rang. Slowly, one storefront at a time, the block began to breathe again. Gloria refused every interview, every ceremony, every arranged recognition the town tried to organize in her name, declining them all with the same calm she had shown Carl Briggs on the first day he set his coffee cup on her counter without asking. One morning, a reporter found her restocking the soup shelf near the front window and asked her directly why she had never told anyone in Alderton what she had once done and who she had once been. She set the box of cans on the shelf, considered the question for a moment with the unhurried attention she gave to everything, and said that the work was never about her. It was about making sure the people who had built this block could keep building it. The reporter waited for more. Gloria picked up the box and returned to the shelf, and the conversation closed as gently as it had opened. On the wall behind the counter, where a crooked calendar had hung forgotten for years, there was now an American flag, and beside it, a single worn beret, faded, no longer hidden away in a filing cabinet drawer, visible to anyone who came through the green door and cared to look up. The register still stuck on the third drawer. The bell still rang when someone came in. And every morning before she unlocked the door, Gloria stood at the front window with her coffee and watched the street, the way she had watched it for 19 years. But now, for the first time in a long time, the street looked back at her with nothing to hide. If this story moved you, if you felt something shift in your chest when that helicopter landed and justice finally showed up in a parking lot in Alderton, Georgia, please take a moment right now and hit the like button, because every like tells us to keep finding these stories and bringing them to you. And if you want to be here when the next one drops, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss it. We read every single comment, and we want to know, have you ever been in a situation where you had to decide between staying quiet and standing your ground? What did you choose, and what happened? Tell us in the comments below, because your story matters too. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who is dealing with something that feels too big. Or someone who has forgotten that real power was never meant to intimidate people. It was meant to protect them. We will see you in the next one.